Good morning, everyone. What we're going to talk about is Protestant Reformation and fierce community. So from these standpoint, we're going to do two of these lectures at one setting, and it might be rather long, but I'm going to try and speed it up just a little bit and only hit the salient parts. And the reason why I'm doing them both at the same time is because the Protestant Reformation and a fierce community go hand in hand. It's because it was these Protestant communities that will make up the Puritan communities, Protestant communities that will make up the bulk of the population that spreads out from the Massachusetts Bay Company. So we have to know a little bit about the Protestant Reformation in Europe and what that meant for those people in Europe who will be Protestants who will be coming over to settle in the New World, especially Puritans, English Puritans. So the time period that we're looking at is between 1517 and 1648. All right, so all you Rastafari out there should get your pens and paper ready so we can start almost immediately. Okay, so what we should do is look back a little bit at the Renaissance period. And so what you ought to do is do some little bit of thinking about how did the Renaissance movements going back from the 14th century through the 16th, through the 17th centuries, how this really influenced the events that we'll be seeing that we'll be seeing in terms of how the people, the Puritan communities, early American Puritan communities, how they were able to construct their society. So, for example, the Renaissance gave us the idea of self-creativity and this wellspring and highlighting of individualism. Right, the humanist movement in Europe, the one that placed emphasis on the individual and on the human, and the secular, although that is very much a religious sort of movement, it just illustrated and highlighted the individual as a secularized individual within society who could be at the same time a religious person within that society. So you could say that there were some things that people saw during this time period that were clearly, that they believed in their minds were clearly non-religious, like work and making money, to those being religious by taking that money that you made at the work and paying your tithes with it. So within Protestant life, we're going to get the idea of extreme capitalism as being illustrative of God's blessing bestowed on the individual. So Europe becomes much more secularized. Gold and silver are flooding into Europe, making them more prosperous, especially gold and silver flooding in from the Americas into places like Spain. And by the way, you should note that all this money that's coming into places like Spain is literally going to destroy their societies years down the road, because as they get wealthy, they will also become slothful. Discovery of new lands, growth in royal power, centralized monarchies. So the new lands, as we talked about in mercantilism, will help them. The growth in royal power, more money means more strength, more armies, larger armies, more munitions, etc., more spies, more ships. So growth in royal power and centralization of monarchies. So the monarchies, as they become much more powerful, are starting to consolidate power. And when they consolidate power, that means they become much more centralized. Their power is much more centralized. And we see this especially, particularly in England and in France as well. Also, we see in 1451, I believe, is the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. And so the dissemination of Bibles, especially in the vernacular. And what I mean by the vernacular is that the Gutenberg press and other presses are going to allow Bibles to be made quickly rather than being handwritten out by scribes, monks. These Bibles are going to be printed out in rapid succession because they're using typeset. And they can now print Bibles. Well, they'll eventually be able to print Bibles in traditional languages that ordinary people speak and not in the Latin, which is the language of the church. So ordinary people can read the Bible where they couldn't at first, and they could extract out of the Bible the things that they wanted or they needed or their own interpretations. In some ways, that is a highlight of this idea of individualism, but in other ways, you can look at it, some people would argue, as not necessarily good because it's led to this proliferation of religions. And people, I think, have lost the overall message of religions. They're expecting God and heaven to be out somewhere when the actual message of God was always that heaven and God was in yourself. Jesus said as much, right? So although this is not a religious course, we can see where the Gutenberg printing press would be instrumental in helping release those ties and bonds that people had to the Catholic Church. We get also, with this growth of the printing press, the spread of and growth of universities and the emergence of a literate public. So people are not interested in taking the word of the clergy or even royal power any longer. They're able to read and think for themselves. So this is something that's new and emerging in Europe in this time period. There's also discontent with the Catholic Church. And as I stated, that people could not read Latin, so that they couldn't read a Bible and get any message of it. And there was somewhat of a distance between the clergy and the people. Church rituals, many people believe, that were unhelpful in personal salvation. Yes, the rituals are happening, but my life, it's still, maybe it's not happy. Maybe I'm living an unhappy life and lots of things are happening to me. And how is the church helping me? In ancient societies, what they did is that people were bound together through a set of guiding mythologies and guiding ritual practices that tied people together and bound them together. Rituals were not just for the clergy. Everybody participated in those rituals. Mystery systems. But here, with the Catholic Church, we get the destruction of these mystery systems, of these rituals. And so one gets a sense that church is to not be a participatory activity, but one where an individual watches, right, from a distance. And that, I think, was the thing that cut so many people off from the Catholic Church, was this sense of that there is this separation between the church and the individual, and people wanted to feel part of the church. And I think that was the great failing of the Catholic Church. The secularization of church hierarchy. As the Catholic Church began to grow and prosper, as wealth was coming in from from places like the Americas, and of course these kingdoms were enriching the church, paying their tithes to the church, it got to the point where many leaders of the church became they were not religious people. There were many instances where the Pope was an individual who may have had somewhat rather dubious ties to the church, but was given the office of the Pope because his family could afford to pay a certain fee. Many people, average people, were angry at the church's wealth when they could look all around them and see the squalor and poverty of Europe. So people were angry at the sloth and corruption that develops within most institutions over a number of years as they grow more wealthy and more powerful. Give you a couple of instances. There's Sixtus IV, 1471 to 1484, who was a pope, but he taxed brothels. He didn't shut them down, but he taxed them. He instituted also a tax on priests who kept mistresses. He didn't forbid priests to keep mistresses, he taxed them. He sold a thing called penances and indulgences, and quite simply what these are is that if an individual committed sin, they could have those sins forgiven by the church and God if they just essentially paid a fee. Now, this is all fine and dandy if you have a lot of money, but what about people who are poor? How can they get their sins taken care of if they can't afford the fee? There were even wagons that priests drove that and they fashioned them, they decorated them with crosses and flowers, and they would wheel these things from town to town, and for fee they would forgive people's sins. And wouldn't you think that a sin should be forgiven for free? But this is how the church and the local parishes made their money. So people looked at this stuff, the taxing on brothels and the tax on priests by Sixtus the Fourth, and they just thought that that was corrupt. And many people railed against it. There was Alexander the Sixth, 1492 to 1503, who fathered 7 children by 2 different mistresses. So you can see from this that one gets the idea that there is or could be corruption within the church. I'm quite sure that if you take the time out to Google, you'll find individuals like Lucretia Borgia, who was the daughter, I believe, of Alexander the Sixth, and she was a known femme fatale. So quite interesting background that we have of popes. There was a Dominican priest by the name of Johann Tetzel. I believe Johann Tetzel lived from 1465 to 1519. You should go back and Google that really quickly. My memory might fail me, but I'm quite sure he lived from 1465 to 1519, the Dominican priest. And he had a saying that went something like this. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory sings. In other words, as soon as you tossed a coin in the coffer, then that soul would be released out of purgatory and into heaven, so to speak. And so for priests like Johann Tetzel, it was all about the money, right? Then we begin to see rumblings of reform by church ministers, church officials, some of them well known, some of them not so well known, who were then going to be railing against the church and trying to get the church to reform itself. Probably the most famous of these Catholic reformers was a man named Martin Luther, Luther, who wrote what we call today the 95 Theses in 1517. And the 95 Theses, which were essentially hammered on the church door, because that's where they would essentially place all readings on the church door. So when you happened to be passing by the church on your way to work or whatever you were doing during the day, you could read whatever the church edict. But the 95 Theses called for these reforms in the church by Martin Luther. And of course, the reforms were in keeping with some of the things that we talked about. Now, this began, it didn't sort of start the Reformation, but it was the most, I think, the most salient point in the Reformation, where there was this out-and-out demonstration by one of its church members towards the Catholic Church. And this began a whole movement where individuals and communities began to separate themselves from the church. We begin to see other groups, Lutherans, Reformed, Calvinists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, Anabaptist groups springing up all over Europe, especially within England. And we can see from this that Martin Luther had quintessentially began the dissolution of the Catholic Church in much part of the world, especially within Europe, and then, of course, later in the Americas. Now, what we get with these individuals breaking off from the church because of the slothful corruption and ideas of the church, we begin to see the springing up of what we call Protestant, and those were some of the names of the groups that I mentioned earlier, the Lutherans and the Calvinists and Presbyterians, etc. So from these groups, they are now somewhat put into position. These former Catholics now are put into position to be a threat to the Catholic Church. And of course, individuals like Martin Luther were hunted down by the Catholic Church, and many others were burned at the stake for essentially being heretics. So you should do some background reading on that. Your textbook has some excellent more background on the Protestant Reformation, but what I want you to do is key in on the splintering off of individuals, especially within England, away from the Catholic Church, and of course within other parts of Europe, Switzerland, etc., and other areas. This splintering, Germany, this splintering off of these individuals now puts them into direct contestation with the Catholic Church. Okay? So what we're going to see is not only wars between kingdoms, but wars between religious groups and religious orders. Another interesting person that became a Protestant was a man named John Calvin, who was actually a French Protestant who would eventually live a portion of his life in Switzerland. Unlike the Catholic Church, who believed that faith was the key to salvation, good works was the key to salvation, Calvin believed that faith was the way to salvation. Faith leading to salvation. So, with this, Calvin then argued that only a select few were destined to be God's, essentially, chosen people. So Calvin gained a lot of adherents. There were a lot of individuals who followed the teachings of John Calvin. And we call these people, for the most part, Calvinists. But they adhered to a certain form of worship that we would call Calvinist, or will eventually be called, in essence, Puritan. Later on, we would call Puritan. Now, that's essentially it for the Protestant Reformation. And what you ought to understand is that the implications for this are far-reaching. One of the things that I'd like you to do is to key in on Belfast, Ireland, present day. And you can go back into the 1960s and 70s and really see the violence in Belfast, where Protestants were pitted against Catholics. And you can see from that the town is almost completely divided. Belfast, Ireland is divided between these Protestant and Catholic communities, where the Catholic communities in Belfast are the minority and the Protestants are the majority, while the rest of Ireland, the majority are Catholic. So from that standpoint, a small portion of Northern Ireland belongs to England or Great Britain, and the rest of Ireland is a separate country. But you should at least spend a few minutes looking at that. You can just Google the history of Catholic and Protestant strife in Belfast, Ireland, and it'll sum up everything that I've kind of been talking about. So the thing that you ought to focus in on is obviously the growing threat of Islamic power in the East, and that's why we were the Europeans searched for other routes, which led directly to the discoveries of new lands, which led to the discovery of the Americas, which in turn led to Europeans coming over to the Americas, and these people would either be Protestants or Catholics, setting up that kind of a dynamic. And then you have the growing discontent among the poor, especially in terms of what faith can and cannot do for them, or the church. We see the growing spread of mercantile activity, the growth of wealthy families, especially in urban areas, especially in places like London, England, the consolidation of church power, and of course the belief in personal salvation. So with those things in mind, we'll jump over to fierce community. Now the church within England, the Catholic Church, is going to begin to splinter apart with Henry VIII. And that is a well-known story that I won't belabor here in this video for time, but of course in your readings you will read quite extensively about Henry VIII's movement to sever his ties with the Catholic Church in order to get his divorce and get remarried. But when that happens, that new church is going to be run by Henry, then it will be called essentially the Church of England. And that Church of England, as a Protestant religion, or tied to Henry VIII, will essentially be constituted around 1534. The trappings of the church, all the ornate rituals and all of that kind of stuff, and the bureaucratic hierarchy is all there, still in the church. Basically what they've done is just severed the ties. A couple of things that they do different, though, then what they've done differently, I guess, in the Catholic Church was that there was not strict observance of the Sabbath. So what you're going to find within England is people under this new Church of England, I believe, become less religious. I think even in America, people are less religious. There wasn't large church following or going in this early English America, and we're not going to get that until in America, United States America, until much later with the First and Second Great Awakenings. But even today, people will tell that that they go to church, but the churches themselves argue that people really don't, that they just say that they go to church. And then that's particularly true, I think, in England. But let's get back to John Calvin for a second. John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, he was a French theologian, lived in Europe, or Switzerland, as I stated. His main work is The Institution of Christian Religion in 1562. And I've already mentioned a few things about Calvin, but just off the top of my head, I just remembered a few more. One of them is he believed in the total depravity of man, that human beings are essentially evil and not good, and that we must strive to do better. Of course, I did talk about the unconditional election, and God has already selected his chosen children, etc. But you can do your own background reading on that. You should look at the idea of limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of saints. Also, one of the key areas that I think that you should take with you is the idea of limited church membership. These early Calvinists kind of believed that not everybody could become a member of the church, that it was only for a select chosen few. And that's why those early pilgrim communities, they divided the population into sinners and saints, right? Or just non-believers, right? That's the idea of the limited membership. Many members of the Church of England wanted the church to become much, much more secularized, in the sense that they wanted to strip out the trappings of the church, all the ornate rituals. They wanted to limit church membership. All of these things, those people tended to be Calvinist, and those people would later separate out of the Church of England. There were lots of backlash from people within the Church of England, and what we're going to see is a splintering off of a large portion of individuals who later would be called Puritans. These Puritans are going to agitate so forcefully for the separation, and many of them will also participate in the capturing and killing of Charles I. You should do some background reading on that as well, because it'll give you some idea of the Puritan leadership within England and its real movement towards keeping England away from reverting back to Catholicism, and the trouble that they have with Charles I 1600 to 1649. So what we're going to get is these more radical individuals within the Church of England, these Calvinists or Puritans who want the church to be pure, are going to be ideal candidates to be targeted for recruiting to go venture off to discover new lands. And the Massachusetts Bay Company that was formed in 1628 is going to try to do its extensive part in getting many of these Puritans to leave England. And that would essentially, many people, and at the time period, believed that that was a good thing to get rid of these more forceful separatists within the Church of England. One of them is an individual that you should have some working knowledge of at this point, is Jonathan Winthrop, 1588 to 1649, who's going to write the Model of Christian Charity, 1630, that you are required to read for this course. And essentially what the Model of Christian Charity does is it outlines a purpose of God in the New World, or in New England. But what it really did is that it set the tone for how we as a nation would build our own self-identity. This is what I believe the power of the treatise, the Model of Christian Charity by Winthrop, what it did for us. It gave us our American identity. And the thing that I think that you need to look at is the idea of that these individuals coming to America would be pure of heart, pious, religious, hardworking, prizing religious freedom, wanting to escape religious persecution, toleration, right, for others. At least that's the overall belief or feeling. So these, I believe, are the hallmarks of the character of or at least our American identity. We as Americans believe that we're pure people, that we're hardworking, that we believe in religious freedom. I think all of this is tied back into the model of Christian charity and those first early Americans. And these individuals who came would be setting up their colonies, as you'll see from your textbook, all throughout the New England area, which stretches all the way from, let's say, down through Rhode Island, all the way up through to Canada, essentially, or what we would consider to be Maine today. So we're going to get settlements, Puritan settlements in Plymouth, 1620, Salem, about 1629, Hartford, about 1636. We're going to see Providence around the same time, New Haven around 1638, I believe. But these are essentially going to be these Protestant communities. Now, when these communities set themselves up in America, they're going to set themselves up under a rigid structure of society within New England based around the idea of what we call covenant theology. Now, covenant theology is basically the individuals, the people, developing a social covenant with God. And as long as that social covenant is kept, then those individuals will not fall from grace. The social covenant, as we call covenant theology, helps to create and maintain, or at least they believed, a perfect society. The societies themselves were built around this covenant, the idea, and not only just in terms of psychologically, but the entire towns were developed around this idea. If you were to take a look at a map of a New England town, what you would find is that the town was built around a plaza or square. Homes circle that plaza or square, and individuals would essentially meet in those areas for meetings. And this is where we begin to see the springings up of democracy within America in these early Puritan communities. Now, within these early Puritan communities, the educated were seen as leaders by right. So there is automatically this social stratification that we do see with the well-born and the educated being at the top, and the lesser well-born and the less educated filling out the bottom portions of society. But that didn't mean that those individuals who led these communities, right, were interested in keeping the poor oppressed. In these early Puritan communities, the poor were giving free education, which even in today in America, we still are struggling with the idea that education ought to be open and free and have free access for all. Smallest sins are punished in these communities. Church attendance was mandatory. Knowledge of the Bible is essential. And essentially, no one in these Puritan communities lived by themselves. So what you have within these early Puritan communities, a sort of localized small community built around the idea of religion, covenant theology as the centerpiece, and the focal point by which the community members all shared and worked and labored and lived and died, tied into this social structure. We won't begin to see the loosening of this social structure until many, many more people come into these communities who in themselves are not Protestant, or they don't necessarily believe in the strict ethos of the Calvinists or the Puritans. What's interesting about these communities is something, and I picked this up from something that Jane Austen once wrote, that everyone in an English village lived in a community of voluntary spies. And what she was meaning by this is that these small English communities, essentially everybody knew everything, right? And so that's what kind of happens in these small communities, and that's going to be somewhat what's going to happen in Puritan communities. Colonial populations are essentially, these early ones from about 1650s to the 1700s, are essentially the character is unaristocratic. The vast majority of people that will come will not be well-born or wealthy. You'll get large numbers of middle class, business people, and a whole wellspring that we'll begin to see of poor English laborers. Now, these early communities, there was a right and a duty to intervene in the lives of the people around you. So they called it keeping a holy watchfulness of their neighbors. So what happens in these communities is that everybody within them, so to speak, is watching and looking out for everyone. At least that's the idea. What's going to happen in some of these communities is that it's not just people looking out for each other. It is individuals who turn on each other. Since you know everything about everybody, you may not necessarily like a person, and so therefore you may not be akin to being agreeable with your neighbor, and you know your neighbor's weaknesses, and that's going to be sort of a thing. Many people claim that these small communities are stifling, right? That everybody knows your business, right? And today we kind of like people to not, and keep some distance. Everybody likes to have their privacy. So the oversight by the neighbors is exacerbated by the idea that Americans will become increasingly obsessed with their reputation and good name. Puritans are sensitive to shame and public humiliation. And so these people are going to try to do everything in their power to keep their name in good light. These individuals prized harmony within the community, but these communities eventually will become riven with personal conflict. And we begin to see this with the witchcraft accusations of Salem and other areas within New England. Malicious lawsuits. We become a very litigious society. And this, in large degree, indicates that there was less harmony than we thought within these societies. Of course, there's the local grapevine where everybody knows everything. Neighborhood bonds are encouraged, so the solidification of the neighborhood. There were no community institutions like hospitals or daycare centers or any of those things, so people came to others' rescue. The communities raised all of the children. But there was strict discipline was encouraged for unruliness. Whippings, banishments, fines, and all of this stuff was done out in the air, out in public, in those common areas. People were put in the stockade in common areas, and people would walk by during their day and see you basically standing there all day being punished. Marriages bound the community to each other, and so the goal in these early Puritan communities was to ensure that marriages were happy ones. They protected stable and peaceful marriages, and even when marriages weren't stable and peaceful, they essentially intervened and tried to make them that way. So the neighborhoods essentially, the neighbors essentially wanted you to have a good relationship. Child rearing is going to be difficult in these early communities. We get a strange mix of indifference, affection, economics, and love. And what I mean by that is that lots of early deaths, right? So women are going to experience in these early Puritan communities childbearing experiences that will result in the death of their children. And with that comes a certain kind of psychological sort of cloud that envelopes all of these early communities that the communities will struggle to get over. And I'll give you an example. In the Mayflower in 1620, 3 of the 100 or so passengers were pregnant. Elizabeth Hopkins, Susanna White. They were both about 7 months pregnant. Hopkins has a daughter that she names Oceanus. Oceanus doesn't survive the first winter. White's daughter, Peregrine, lives to be 80. So with these 2 women, we see that there's only a 50% survival rate. Then Mary Norris Allerton, who is the 3rd person that's pregnant, her child dies stillborn. So 2/3 of the children in these early Puritan communities on the Mayflower are dying. So with that comes a certain sort of psychological ferment around the community. Childbearing is difficult. About 1% of the women who give birth die, right? So women have a 1 in 8 chance of dying giving birth to children, and they die from everything from exhaustion, dehydration, infections, hemorrhaging, convulsions, you name it. What this means, in essence, is that women are going to be a highly prized commodity within these communities because there's such a short rift of women. There are few single women. Most women will be married by the time they're 21. A lot of women will be married by the time they're 17. Women, once you get married, you'll be pregnant every 2 years, and the average will be that you'll have a child every 8 years. Right? Or, I'm sorry, you'll have at least 8 children. Of those 8 children, 5 of them will typically die. So you'll be pregnant every 2 years, and you'll have on average 8 children, and of those 8 children, 5 of them will die. So you tell me what the psychological cloud that will be hanging over many of these Puritan communities. Would it be healthy or not healthy? Cotton Mather used to have a poem that I memorized a little while ago that went something like this. Go into burying place, children, you will there see graves as short as yourselves. Yea, yea, you may be at play one day, dead, dead the next. So what Cotton Mather is basically saying with this saying, he used to recite this poem to his children to kind of toughen them up. One thing that you ought to pull from this section is that when these early Puritan communities begin to form, the communities become very diverse in terms of its economics. Seafaring, mining, individual craftsmen, small farms will be the hallmark of the northern economy. And that's due to the climate and the soil. Those individuals who are coming into the South, not Puritans, but later we'll begin to see lots of English people coming into the South, and there'll be a lot of Scots-Irish and etc. These individuals will formulate an agricultural system or an economy based on agriculture. And that agricultural system will largely feature rice, indigo, and tobacco. So we'll get a diversification of the economy quickly. Okay, I'm just thinking of where we need to keep going. You ought to key in on the expectations versus reality of colonial life, and we've talked about that just a little bit, and I'd like for you to do that by focusing in on the Salem witch trials. And this will give you a good example of what we call the sort of disharmony within these societies. I also want you to do is spend a few moments looking at the Pequot War in 1637. And the Pequot War, what you'll do is you'll get a good sense of how these early Puritan communities who were going to be bumping up against Native Americans who want more land, or these Puritans want more land, and what are going to be the problems with these early Puritan communities in obtaining more land for the large numbers of people, the fresh congregations who come in and there's no land available. Pequot War starts about 1637, and Jonathan Winthrop is going to play a major role in that. And what's going to kill off many of the Pequots and render them unable to fight back, of course, is a narrative from Jared Diamond's work that many of them are going to be weakened by smallpox. So what we get within England is about 70,000 English men and women who come to the New World in about a 12-year period, setting up cities according to this Christian Protestant model. These early colonies, especially in New England, setting themselves up with a strong Christian heritage. Strict adherence without dissent is going to lead to some severe consequences. So people that come in are going to strictly adhere, but there's no method or no system for dissenters to be able to have a voice. There is little tolerance for women, and we begin to see this, and I really want you to pick this up with the Salem witch trials, what they do to women who are, in essence, single, or women who can't defend themselves, the elderly, or women who might be living alternative lifestyles. Okay, that kind of sums it up. We could do this much more justice, but again, these videos are only intended to supplement, not be the basis by which you learn. I just want you to key in on the various parts that I was speaking about. And so if you use them in conjunction with your readings and the notes and your own research, I hope this helps you proceed.